So let's say you found a skeleton. How would you tell it's a dinosaur? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
All right, hello everyone. Welcome back to the channel. I am here on this lovely Sunday morning with Tim O'Neill, who runs the blog History for Atheists. Tim, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me on the show, other Tim. I'm going to call you Dapper because it's a bit weird referring to this by my
This is
own
the
name.
most Tims we've had on at one time.
Yeah, we're becoming rare. So about me, my background is that I have a fairly long-standing interest in history, particularly in ancient medieval history. I studied history at university and did a master's degree in medieval poetry after doing a fair bit of study in medieval history. I also have a long-standing interest in the history of Christianity, though I'm an atheist, so I'm looking at it purely from a secular point of view. But why I started History for Atheists? Well, it really began in the mid 2000s when various atheist authors were suddenly becoming quite prominent. And so I had, we had books by people like Dawkins and Hitchens and so on. And I was interested, I suppose. I'm not a dogmatic or sort of militant, if you could call it that, evangelistic atheist. I don't care if other people believe in God. I don't think that belief in God is a delusion. I don't think that religion poisons everything. But I was sort of interested that suddenly atheism was becoming a bit prominent. What I then did was I started looking at some of the blogs and online forums that arose in the wake of the rise of what we call can call the new atheist, new wave of atheism. And what I found on many of those discussion forums was that a lot of the arguments that were being used weren't scientific, they weren't philosophical, they weren't theological, they were historical. So people were making claims about history and using them to make arguments against religion. And so they were pointing to events or what they called trends or thought were trends in history and saying, here is evidence that belief in God is bad. Here is evidence that religion is wrong and evil. The problem that I discovered was that a hell of a lot of what they thought was historical actually wasn't. So a lot of what these arguments were based on ideas that were outdated, that have been rejected by historians, or have never been held by historians in the first place. So they're myths or fringe ideas, such as the idea that Jesus didn't exist at all. So I started arguing against these mistakes because I thought rationalists would be happy to find out that they were mistaken. Some of them were, a lot of them weren't. And the other thing I found was that I was repeating myself because it was the same stuff that was coming up over and over again. So I started my blog, History for Atheists, uh, mainly as a way to save myself time, so that I could write sort of fairly detailed debunking of some of these erroneous historical claims and ideas, and only had to do it once. That actually hasn't worked out very well. In fact, what happened was once I started doing this, my blog gained quite a bit of an audience, and I had people asking me, "When are you going to write a new article?" And I've now launched a video channel and podcast as well. So I've now made a hell of a lot of work for myself. But it seems to be having an effect. I'm starting to see some of the ideas that I used to see presented all the time being presented a little bit less, and people are starting to argue against other people are starting to argue against these ideas. So that's the background to History for Atheists, and that's why the blog is called History for Atheists, because it's by an atheist for atheists. Though I do find some of my followers are believers, I've got probably just as many, if not more, who are atheists, and that was the whole idea. They're my target demographic.
Well, that's really interesting because until I encountered your blog, I never really saw an outlet dedicated to what I saw as these persistent historical myths and misconceptions that are prominent in sort of the anti-religious communities, but especially I find often in more specifically anti-Christian, I find that there seem to be some people who will believe anything as long as it makes Christianity seem less plausible or look bad. And it's like,
Yeah,
that's not a good heuristic. If it makes Christianity look bad, it must be true. Don't go with that, guys.
yeah, and that was part of my
Okay.
motivation. First of all, the only material that I saw that was debunking this stuff was largely from Christian apologists, and that even though most of what they were saying was pretty valid, they were fairly easy to dismiss by the people they were trying to correct because they were Christian apologists. But it's a bit harder for them to dismiss me, but they still do it, and they largely do it by telling me that I'm actually secretly a
I was
Christian
about to ask
apologist.
about that.
Oh yeah, that happens all the time, and anyone who knows me finds that pretty bloody hilarious because I'm definitely not a Christian. Um, the I think the other issue is exactly what you said, that there's this tendency that if it makes Christianity look bad or makes Christianity look stupid or makes Christianity look in any way delusional, then it should be accepted and defended to the death. And this is an attitude by some people which is bizarre. And I suppose I've got a very Irish sense of hypocrisy. And when people are saying you should pay attention to experts, you should pay attention to the consensus of scholars, you should check your facts, you should be aware of confirmation bias. And they're saying that to Christians about things like
Right.
science, for example. Yet aren't practicing what they preach when it comes to history and are doing the exact opposite of that, then that annoys me a bit. And so this is why I take a certain degree of delight in puncturing some of the more pompous anti-theistic atheists. And people say, well, you're mean and you're cruel and so on. Well, yeah, I kind of am. I'm a bit of a bastard, but um, and I readily admit it. But the same people who complain about my tone don't seem to have a problem when those same people are using a similar tone to attack believers.
Yeah.
So there's a little bit of hypocrisy in the tone
Well,
policing
look,
as
no
well.
one wants that kind of tone to be directed at them. They want it to be directed at the people they count as the bad guys.
Yeah,
So,
that's right. And I think the other thing I do find is that the fanaticism of some of these sort of dogmatic beliefs, it's intriguing that it mirrors a similar sort of fanaticism on the part of religious believers. So these people who are saying they are fanatics, pointing at religious believers, behave in exactly the same way, cling to myths that they find convenient, resist correction, ignore consensus of experts when it's convenient to them. And I find that kind of ironic and take a certain delight in pointing this
all
out.
right. Well, let's actually dig into some bits about history. Previously on this channel, while I promised to follow it up, I haven't yet, and I'm actually counting this as a follow up. I did a video um, going over the very basics of what is the Council of Nicaea about, what is it not about, what it didn't have anything to do
Yeah,
with, selecting books for the Bible. It wasn't the invention of Christ's deity in Christianity. It wasn't. Yeah, it was not
yeah,
about any of these things. But so let's go on from there because people can check out that video or they can
sure.
check your blog, which is linked in the description for stuff like that. Um, so another big
Yeah,
one that I hear is that the Catholic Church or Christianity generally was retarding our ability to do things like geography because they insisted that the Earth was flat into the 15th century, which I don't know
yep,
how anyone got that idea because it's like from the first century, most people didn't think the Earth was flat, at least in like the old world, in like the Mediterranean area and stuff like that. So
yep.
where does this come from, and how do we know that that is completely nonsense?
Sure. Okay, well, let's take Nicaea
Oh yeah,
first because I've literally just come from editing a video that I'm doing for my own channel on exactly this issue, the whole idea that the Emperor Constantine is this, well, Constantine is this evil villain who hijacked Christianity and did it all for his own evil political ends. So the story that you get, and it's found in lots of popular culture, it's repeated by prominent atheists. Richard Dawkins, for example, is a repeat offender on this. And I have as part of my video, I have Joe Rogan He's maybe not a prominent, well, he is a prominent atheist, having a bit of a rant about this, and Peter Boghossian, who was his guest on that show, telling him how wonderful he is for pointing out that all this is true. So the story is that that the Bible was put together by a vote at the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. This was called by the Emperor Constantine because he was a pagan, but he basically hijack Christianity for political purposes, and he wanted to make sure the Bible only included books that fitted with the conception of Jesus that fitted his agenda. So it was the Council of Nicaea that put the Bible together. It was the Council of Nicaea that declared Jesus to be a god. And before that, people didn't believe that. These are quite prominent ideas. It's found in the Da Vinci Code, for example. And it's all
I think there was one true sentence that Constantine called the council. I think that's the only thing you said that I would actually agree with.
The Da Vinci Code is an amazing book in that virtually every single so-called historical fact that it touches on, it gets wrong. And it's quite incredible that, I mean, even if you were trying to get things wrong, you probably couldn't have got a hit rate like that. So well done to Dan Brown. But it's more worrying when someone who is held up as a great thinker like Richard Dawkins says that the Bible was put together at the Council of Nicaea, or Christopher Hitchens states quite blatant and quite explicitly in God Is Not Great that he adopted Christianity for political purposes. So what's going on here? First of all, the Council of Nicaea was called primarily to solve a theological problem. You had a debate within Christianity at the time about not whether or not Jesus was God, because they all believed that.
Yeah, it would be hard to find someone who wasn't a believer in Jesus' divinity.
Yeah. Yeah, there might have still been some sort of Jewish Ebionite style Christians at that point, but very few. So the problem was very much about him being God, because if he was God and God the Father was God, then who's actually God? This was the difficulty. They'd already had the concept of the Trinity, God the Father, God the Son, and the Holy Spirit, but there was a debate about how they stood in relation to each other. Was God the Father superior to the Son? Was the Son created, in other words, by God the Father, and therefore was he inferior to God the Father? Or were they all equal? And what the council ruled was that they were all equal, and that the Son was not subordinate to the Father. That is standard Christian belief now as a result, but they could have gone the other way. So this was a debate about what's called the Arian controversy. There was a guy called Arius who was a priest in Alexandria, who was teaching that the Son was subordinate to the Father. And the council voted on whether Arius was right, and the vote overwhelmingly went to Arius. Arianism didn't die out. It continued. In fact, several Roman emperors in the 4th century were actually Arians. And Constantine himself was actually baptized by an Arian bishop. And then some of the Germanic tribes that took over what was the Western Roman Empire were also Arian. So Arianism was quite a strong strand of Christianity in these early centuries. It eventually died out. So that's what the vote was about. It wasn't about was he God. They already believed he was God. They've been believing that since about the 2nd century, at least. So that it wasn't, they weren't making him into God. The Bible was put together at Nicaea thing has even less foundation, because if you look at any document, any source relating to the Council of Nicaea, and we have quite a few of them, no mention anywhere of the books of the Bible being selected. So where did this myth come from? Well, it actually comes from the 18th century. In the 18th century, Voltaire made a kind of a joke. He found a fairly obscure miracle story in an 8th century Greek text that he found as in a kind of a footnote in an encyclopedia. And this miracle story said that the Bible had been put together at the Council of Nicaea, and that they put the books on the altar and had prayed, and when they came in the next morning, they'd been stacked up in order of canonicity, with the genuine ones at the top of the pile. Now, this miracle story pops up in the 8th century. There's no other reference to this idea anywhere else in any of the ancient
There's certainly
sources.
nothing like that in the contemporary literature from the
Oh,
fourth.
no,
Yeah,
no. So we don't know where that miracle story came from, but no, there's no references to this at all in any contemporary accounts of the council. And we've got the findings of the council. Like we've got the document that it
right.
produced at the end. No mention of putting together the Bible. You think they'd mention that?
They managed to mention it when to
So
celebrate Easter, but apparently they voted on what was going to be in the Bible, but they didn't mention that.
yeah, that's right. Yeah, they voted on a whole lot of other stuff, really obscure stuff about the organisation of the church, but they didn't mention putting together the Bible. So obviously they didn't do that. Voltaire just made a bit of a joke and said, what an amazing technique, isn't it a pity that we can't use this again today? I don't think Voltaire meant it to be anything other than a bit of a throwaway line, but it got taken very, very seriously and got repeated until it became this kind of factoid that people kind of throw in the face of Christianity. And it's complete crap. The actual canon of the Bible had already more or less been put together before 325. So we've got the what's called the Muratorian canon, which dates to the late 2nd century, which has about 23 of the 26 books of the current Bible listed as like these are the most important books. We've got a reference to the 4 Gospels being as in the ones that we've got in the current Bible, being the Gospels by Irenaeus in the 2nd century. And then we've got the festal letter of Athanasius in 872, which basically gives us the full canon list. So it was evolving before 325. It continued to evolve after 325. There was no council that actually made a ruling on which books were in the Bible until the Council of Trent in the 16th century. So the idea that it had already been set way back in 325 is completely wrong. The idea that Constantine converted to Christianity for political reasons, which is something that Hitchens claims and Dawkins endorses and so on, is also complete crap. The idea that converting to Christianity would have a political advantage for a Roman emperor like Constantine is nonsense. The way you became an emperor in the 4th century was by having a loyal army at your back and being able to defeat your enemies in battle. And this is what Constantine did. He won the support of the army because the army already loved his dad, Constantius Chlorus. So he had the support of the Western Roman army. He then challenged one of his co-emperors, Maxentius, and defeated him at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312. And after that, the army just considered that he was pretty much unbeatable. He won every battle he ever fought, so the army kind of liked
Yeah,
that.
that's the kind of thing an army
Because
likes. They like winning.
particularly late Roman armies, because that meant they got plunder and they got
Mhm.
bonus checks. They got what we call donatives, which they got if they won major battles. So the army loved him. The equestrian and senatorial class didn't love him as much, but he had the army's support, and so they kind of swung in behind him. But the interesting thing here is that the army was substantially pagan. Christianity was at best maybe about 10% of the population, but it was the 10% that didn't matter. Christianity was largely a lower class religion held by plebeians, by slaves, by ex-slaves who had no political power. So the idea that converting to Christianity would have somehow given him some sort of political edge is actually not just wrong, but gets things completely backwards. If anything, he became emperor despite the fact that he had adopted this strange and largely despised minority faith. Now, once he adopted it, things began to change as far as the faith was concerned. Though Bart Ehrman has written a book fairly recently on the triumph, called The Triumph of Christianity, where he argues if you look at the demographics, Christianity was going to become the majority faith of the Roman Empire by the end of the 4th century anyway. It was already on that trajectory for some complicated reasons. But certainly the emperor becoming a Christian and sponsoring Christianity in a fairly prominent way certainly didn't hurt, and it probably would have made some difference towards that
Now, there's
trajectory.
something I hear less often, but still that I hear, which is that Constantine, in establishing Christianity as his state religion, also then was the guy who ordered that pagan temples be torn down and made the older religions illegal to practice in the Roman Empire.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. Well, first of all, Constantine didn't make Christianity the
Right.
state religion. And this is something that's often said, and it is completely wrong, and something else that Dawkins and Hitchens get wrong. Constantine was actually very careful not to, and Christianity didn't become the state religion of the Roman Empire until Theodosius, which was in 381. So that was a long, long time after, towards the end of the fourth century, so a long time after Constantine's time. Constantine was actually pretty diplomatic about the fact that he'd adopted this faith. He kind of had to be for about the first 20 years of his reign. He wasn't the sole emperor. He had a co-emperor in the east, Licinius, who was a pagan, and so he had to be very. Constantine had to be very careful not to put the wrong people offside. He really didn't become quite sort of open and give Christianity prominence until after Licinius and he fought yet another civil war, and Licinius was defeated and executed. In the early stages of his reign, Constantine still put pagan symbols on his coins. The triumphal arch that he raised in Rome to celebrate his victory at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge has iconography that's basically pagan. It's mainly recycled from earlier monuments, so it's not like he carved or commissioned pagan symbols. But the inscription on that arch is carefully neutral. It just says, "Inspired by divinity, he chose to save Rome from a tyrant." It doesn't say which divinity. So anyone looking at that inscription could assume that he was referring to, say, the sun god Sol Invictus, or to Apollo, who were the gods that Constantine had worshipped before. So he was actually quite careful not to put pagans offside, particularly in the first part of his reign. He did start to pass laws that restricted funding to temples. But the thing about Roman emperors and laws is that we kind of think of a law as like the government passes a law, and then there's a whole bureaucratic apparatus, and including a police force or an army, that enforces it and makes sure that the laws are kept. Ancient Roman laws were a bit different. They were more kind of expressions of policy, statements of the emperor's will. How they were implemented depended very much on the local administrators. So the idea that you get a law that says temples are not to be funded by the state, that doesn't mean that immediately all funding to temples stopped. What we do find, though, over the course of the fourth century is that funding, both state and private, to pagan temples began to decline, and the temples began to fall into disrepair, and many of them were turned into churches. Some of them were just turned into community halls, a bit like what's happening with churches in places like more secular countries like Australia and Britain today, where there used to be a church or churches all over the place. Now many of them are becoming other types of buildings. There aren't crazed mobs going and tearing them down. And in ancient Rome, generally speaking, there weren't crazed mobs going around tearing down temples either. There were some, but we have to be very careful there, because pagan sources exaggerate that because they were outraged by it happening when it did happen, and Christian sources exaggerate it because they thought it should happen more, and wanted to encourage it to happen. So we have to be careful that this image that paganism was violently suppressed. Actually, what we find, there's a very good book on this called "The Last Pagan Generation" by Edward J. Watts. What we find is that it was quite a gradual transition over about 3 generations, and generally pretty peaceful. People sometimes exaggerate and emphasize the incidences of violence, and there were occasional incidences of violence on both sides. But there were militant pagans who attacked and killed Christians as well. You don't hear about that as much. So the idea that Constantine imposed Christianity is completely wrong, and the idea that some of his edicts that that look along those lines were somehow like universally enforced is actually completely wrong. It was a gradual process, and it happened over the course of the fourth century. But paganism was still legal privately right into the sixth and seventh centuries. It just sort of slowly died out.
Okay. Well, let's get into the question about the shape of the Earth, because I remember hearing in school, actually, in a public school, that Christopher
Yep.
Columbus, in the towards the end of the 15th century, actually managed to finally prove to Europeans that the Earth was round because he came to the Americas, which doesn't make any sense because he would have actually had to get to China for real in order to prove it. So even the story doesn't
Yeah.
make sense. I didn't make the connection as a kid, but
Yeah.
after doing things like, getting my own degree in history, yeah, turns out no, that's nonsense. So what's the deal there? Where does that myth come from? What are some of the ways that we know that that is absolutely not the case about Europe in the 15th century, that they didn't know the Earth was round already?
Sure. So, like a lot of these myths, they kind of began with like one book. So I mentioned before about Voltaire making that joke about the Council of Nicaea, and that's turned into this whole myth. Um, in this case, it's Washington Irving, so the author of the Legend of Sleepy Hollow, writing in the 1830s. He was asked by his editors to write a fictionalized biography of Christopher Columbus, and it was to celebrate an upcoming anniversary of Columbus's voyage. Irving did the research and found that the story of Columbus is actually pretty boring. He convinced Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain that he could sail to the Indies by sailing west over the Atlantic, and they let him do that, and he did that at the end. So it didn't make for a very exciting story. So what Irving had to do was spice things up a bit, and one of the ways a fiction writer spices something up is by introducing antagonists to their protagonist. Washington Irving introduced the Catholic Church as the bad guys in his story. Now, this is in a period in the history of the United States where a couple of things were happening. First of all, the US at that stage was still a relatively young nation and was kind of looking around for like a founding myth. And most of its founding stories were inconveniently British. So lots of the stories of the early colonies were basically about people coming from Britain. So Columbus provided an alternative to that. The only problem with Columbus was that he was a Catholic. So by making the Catholic Church the opponents to Columbus in story, which he made up completely, that this
Yeah,
thing to
it's
happen.
hard to imagine why the
But by
Catholic Church would
having
actually be opposed to this in real life.
That's right. So by inventing the idea that there was some debate about the shape of the Earth, and the Church taught that the Earth was flat, and Columbus was this brave free thinker and sort of proto-Protestant who defied the Catholic Church and was proven to be right. That was a great story. I mean, it is a good story. This is one of the reasons why it's persisted for so long. The only problem is Irving made it up. It didn't happen. No one in the 15th century believed that the Earth was round. It was flat. I mean, there might have been some peasants who did, but even the evidence indicates that even the average person seemed to have grasped that the Earth was round. There was a debate very early on. So, in about the third, fourth, maybe into the fifth century, there was a bit of a debate within Christianity because the Bible seemed to imply that in certain passages that the Earth was flat. But Greek science had already indicated and proven pretty conclusively that it was round. And by this stage, Christians included some quite learned people who understood all that Greek science. And so we've got writings by, say, St. Augustine saying, look, don't embarrass us by applying biblical literalism when it's pretty clear that these passages are figurative. The earth is round, so don't be stupid. A passage that some of our creationist friends should perhaps go and read. It was pretty clear by that stage that you could reconcile an interpretation of the Bible with the idea that the earth was round, because in this period, and this is something that people need to understand, Christians didn't interpret the Bible literally. I mean, they could interpret parts of it literally, and they did, but there were kind of four levels of what they call exegesis, of which the literal was only one. So it was quite possible for them to reconcile ancient Greek and Roman science with biblical interpretation. They just didn't interpret the Bible at its absolute face value in every respect. The evidence that they knew that the Earth was round is absolutely clear. I mean, Isidore of Seville, all the medieval scholars talk about the Earth being round. The Venerable Bede, Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas even uses the idea that the Earth is round as an example of an objective fact that everyone agrees on. So when he's using an argument to say, well, here's an objective scientific fact, that's the fact that he chooses as his example. And as I mentioned before, there's even some evidence, good evidence, that it wasn't just the elite, the scholarly elite that knew this, that it was common knowledge. So if you look at medieval iconography, the world is not depicted as a disc in medieval paintings and sculptures. It's depicted as a globe. So you've got Jesus sitting on a throne holding an orb, and the orb represents.
Yeah, I was going to bring that up if you didn't. This is ubiquitous in Christian art, is Jesus holding a globe. What's that globe? Well, it's the Earth.
Yeah, that's right. And we've got references in popular literature. So there's a story in a book of travelers' tales called the Travels of Sir John Mandeville, about a guy who travels so far into the east that he comes to a land where he hears people speaking his own language, and he's quite puzzled until he realizes that he's actually come back to his homeland from the west, because he's circumnavigated the Earth. Now, the author assumes that his audience understands how that would work. And we've got common phrases in, say, medieval French, like round like the Earth being round like an apple, or round like a ball. So it seems to have been quite a well-known fact. The idea that the Earth was, they thought the Earth was flat into the 15th century, unfortunately, is still spread by prominent atheists. So I've got a video on this on my channel, where I've got Aaron Ra, who's a prominent anti-creationist, making a complete idiot of himself by insisting that this is true. And I wrote a whole article on why he was wrong, and he very grudgingly had to admit that.
Actually, that incident is what brought the existence of your blog to my attention, because I was aware of that debate, and I was like, why is he trying to argue that Christianity was teaching the Earth is flat in the fifth? Why? And so then I just looked, like, is anyone else responding to this? And then you had, and I was like, oh, here's a great takedown of this whole thing, because it was just giving me a headache. I was like, oh goodness, please stop.
Well, I was contacted by someone after I wrote that article who said that they'd had exactly that argument with Aaron Ra on, I think it was on the Talk Origins news group back in like 2000. So he's been doing this for 20 years. And this again is the kind of fanatical dogmatism that you can sometimes get among anti-theistic atheists, and that's really what I'm trying to fight against.
Now, one of the questions that I got from supporters was if we could kind of clarify the kind of broad strokes about the Crusades, because we get a couple of narratives. One of the narratives is that these were unusually brutal wars of aggression against a peaceful group of primarily Muslims who were minding their own business, and that they were just massive genocides that, maybe rival World War II in the scope of the human tragedy and evil. But then we get the other, and this is not primarily from atheists that you get this is more from Christians, that, the Crusades were a perfectly reasonable response to hundreds of years of aggression. The fact that it took them this long was a matter of, like, nearly inhuman patience with these savage Muslim hordes who were ravaging all throughout Asia and Europe and Africa, and that this is the thing that saved civilization for us. I feel like the truth is in the middle between those two things.
Yeah, you're right. Both those takes are wrong, particularly the second one. And I find the second one is one that kind of arose, particularly in the early 2000s in the wake of 9/11, because there was a lot of, and this is quite political, but particularly in the United States, there were a lot of people on the left who were sort of saying, well, we've been asking for this, we've been meddling in the Middle East since the Crusades, and this is blowback as a result of that. And in reaction to that, right-wing people were saying, well, no, and we don't deserve this, and the Crusades were a defensive war against Muslim aggression. There's a guy called Rodney Stark who's Christian apologist who wrote a book called The Case for the Crusades, which is one of the worst history books I've ever read, where he tries to make this argument. So the argument that let's take the Christian apologist argument first. The argument that the Crusades were a defensive war, they were kind of a medieval version of the Bush doctrine. We've got to fight them over there so we don't fight them here. Just doesn't stand up to scrutiny at all. First of all, there's nothing in the medieval sources to indicate that people in the 11th century, when the Crusades began, had a conception of the Islamic world. They understood, they had an idea of what Islam was, but the idea that there was this thing called Islam that was encroaching on them from all sides and so on is just not something that appears in the sources. They didn't see the forces who happened to be Muslim as being sort of some kind of monolithic or even coordinated set of forces. They saw them quite correctly as local activity. Yes, there certainly was an expansion of Islam, quite an explosive expansion of Islam from the 7th century onwards, and that continued right up into the 10th and even 11th centuries. But what was happening then, that it then kind of flowed, and what was happening then was a resurgent medieval Christian Europe was started expanding in the opposite direction, and the Crusades are just one element of that. But the idea that they were sort of saying, well, we need to fight against the Muslims over there because they are attacking us, they're starting to attack us here. It's simply not found in the sources at all. 30 years before the First Crusade was called, an earlier pope had tried to get Christians in Europe to go to the aid of the Christian kingdoms in Spain, who were fighting a war against Muslim kingdoms in Spain. Most of Spain had been conquered by Muslims way back in the 8th century, and no one was terribly interested. Only a few hundred knights sort of went to the aid of the Kingdom of Castile in its war against these Muslims. So the idea that there was this feeling that they were being attacked from all sides by Islam just doesn't make any sense. The idea that they would fight against this so-called Muslim encroachment by attacking Jerusalem and trying to conquer Jerusalem doesn't make any sense either. In the late 11th century, the political heart of the Islamic world, if you can anachronistically call it that, was Cairo. The intellectual heart was Baghdad, and the spiritual heart was Mecca. So if you were going to try and attack Islam, you would go and launch a strike against one of those, not Jerusalem, which really wasn't terribly important at all, but it was important to Christians. So the other argument is that the Crusades were this terrible thing where these peaceful countries were attacked by these barbarians from the West who were all religious fanatics. That has a little bit more basis, but not much. So the idea that the Muslims were all sitting around, the Arabs were all sitting around smelling flowers and strumming lutes, that's not true. And the whole reason that Jerusalem was in Muslim hands was that they bloody well conquered it. And what had happened in the century before and earlier in the 11th century was there had been some clashes between Christian pilgrims and the Muslim rulers of the Holy Land. And there'd been one particularly mad Muslim leader who had decided to be a bit of a fanatic, and that had actually sort of resonated with Christians back in Europe. So this was sort of the context. But the thing that actually triggered the Crusades was the defeat of the Byzantine Empire by Muslims, who the Turks, who were starting to encroach on what's now Turkey, Asia Minor, and they sent a message to the Pope saying, "Could you send us some aid?" And what they were asking for was maybe a few thousand hardened Norman troops from southern Italy. These guys were some of the toughest fighters in the medieval world, and the Pope kind of saw this as a bit of an opportunity to channel a lot of the aggression, a lot of the warfare that was happening in Europe between Christians towards a better cause. So when he made his Urban II made his sermon at Clermont, which launched the First Crusade, That was what he was thinking, but he certainly wasn't thinking of launching a mass movement. Both he and the Byzantine emperor really sort of thought, maybe if I can get some of these nobles to stop hitting each other and go and hit those guys in the Holy Land and recapture the holy places, which is what the whole objective was all about, then everyone would be happy. What he got, to everyone's surprise, was a mass movement which lasted for centuries. There's a couple of excellent books on the origins of the Crusades, but I think the main thing to remember is that this call for a new type of holy war seems to have tapped into a rising apocalyptic thinking in Europe. The idea that the end times were coming and that this was all going to happen in Jerusalem. And what you got was this mass movement where not just nobles and knights, but also common people. So it was the so-called Peasants' Crusade or the People's Crusade, which marched 4,000 kilometers and got all the way to Jerusalem and captured, against the odds, captured Jerusalem and then held it for 100 years and held Crusader kingdoms in the Middle East for 200 years. In fact, the last Crusader kingdom, the Kingdom of Cyprus, didn't fall until the end of the 15th century. So a lot of people sort of talk about the Crusades as being this sort of disastrous failure. I think in a sense, it was actually a spectacular success in one sense, because it shouldn't have worked. The idea that they could have marched 4,000 kilometers, defeated armies with way bigger than theirs, and captured a number of major Muslim cities and then held them, established kingdoms far away from Europe for hundreds of years is quite remarkable. I'm not saying it's a good thing, but the idea that this was somehow unique and that there was no sort of there was no sort of atrocities or no sort of warfare from the Muslim side, and they were just sort of, as I said, sitting around composing poetry and admiring butterflies is simply nonsense. Was it more violent than any other war of the time? Were they more violent than any other wars of the time? Not really, no. The main thing that gives the Crusades that reputation is the capture of Jerusalem in 1099. What happened there was the Fatimid Arabs who held Jerusalem thought they were going to get relieved, and so when they were given the opportunity to surrender by the Crusader army, they basically laughed at them. And then the Crusader army surprised everyone by storming the walls and capturing the city. And the rules of war, and they fought according to rules of war. The rules of war was that if you offered quarter to a city or fortification and they refused it, then all bets were off. And that's when the army went berserk. And there was a massacre in Jerusalem, which was commented on by the Arab chroniclers as being particularly bloody, and was celebrated by the Christians, who saw it as a vindication by God. One of the things that often gets mentioned is this idea that Crusaders killed so many people that they waded up to their ankles in blood. And there's a great article by Crusader historian Thomas Madden, where he looks at the origin of this. It's actually a reference to something from the Book of Revelation, and it's not meant to be taken literally. But various historians have taken it literally, and you get people talking about, Christopher Hitchens, for example, talks about it quite seriously. And it gets greatly exaggerated until you get versions where it's up there, the blood is up to their knees, or it's even up to the bridles of their horses, which is what the Book of Revelation is.
Yeah, there probably weren't that many people to kill in Jerusalem.
There weren't, and Thomas Madden has a bit of fun working out. He actually calculates how much blood would have needed to have been spilled, and works out that it was something like, I can't remember the exact details, but it was something like 20 times the population of the whole of Jerusalem. So the story is clearly not true, but this is where a part of where the idea that the Crusades were uniquely violent it sort of comes from. Actually, if you look at the warfare in the Crusades, it was very small scale. The armies were small. A lot of the battles were a little more than skirmishes. Some of them were quite big, but the idea that kind of massacre was common is largely wrong. There's also this idea that the objectives of the Crusade were to convert all the Muslims in the Holy Land, which no one at the time mentioned and no one actually tried to do, or to actually exterminate all Muslims from the Holy Land, which again is just
as I remember it, the Crusader kingdoms had large populations of Muslims living there, continuing to be Muslims throughout their entire history, right? Yeah.
The majority. By far the majority. And what we actually find is that the Crusaders, who once they got there, and particularly the ones who were born there, because we had several generations of Europeans in the kingdoms of what we call Outremer, the outer kingdoms, they kind of went native and actually got on quite well with Muslims. So there's a great story by an Arab nobleman who went to Jerusalem and got quite friendly with the Knights Templar. And the Knights Templar had built their church, that was the centre of their religious order, on the site of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And so this Muslim wanted to go and pray at the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And so the Templars said, yeah, no problem. You can just put your prayer mat over there and go and pray. While he was praying, another knight came up to him who didn't speak any Arabic and started to shout at him, and then picked him up physically and tried to turn him around and was pointing towards the east. And this Arab guy was quite confused, and the Templars came over and calmed everything down, and they said, look, he's new. He's just come out from France. He doesn't understand. He's trying to get you to pray towards the east because that's the way Christians pray, but he doesn't understand that you're praying towards Mecca. And then they bundled this guy out and they apologized to the Arab and said, we're really sorry. He's fresh off the boat. He doesn't know what he's doing. So they kind of got on quite well. And they adopted a lot of local customs and brought them back to Europe as well. There's also a reference by the same guy about how happy the Muslim peasants were under the rule of Christians because they had more rights. Because they held a lot of rights that were common in places like England and France were then brought over to these kingdoms, and the peasants liked it. They kind of preferred to have Christian rulers. So the idea that it was some kind of evil, oppressive colonial regime is not correct. But the idea also that it was sort of some noble enterprise, which is something that right wingers in the alt right has tried to pick up lately, is also total nonsense as well. Like all things, the as you say, the truth is somewhere in the middle, and it's usually much more complicated than the cartoon versions that people try to press into service as kind of moral.
Yeah, one of the things I try to get across to people sometimes is history is less full of heroes and villains than you think. There are people who are painted as heroes and villains, but most of them really aren't either of those things.
Yeah, it's absolutely right.
Okay, so this is actually something that I was planning on asking anyway, and it came in as a member chat from Vandalia 1998, who has been a member for 15 months. Thank you very much. That is awesome. So was the church teaching the Earth was the center of the universe a rumor too, or did they actually do that in the time of Galileo? And I want to make that sort of a broader thing. So the narrative I think most people get with the Galileo trial is that, there's the extremely conservative Catholic Church who will not brook any disagreement over the nature of the universe being geocentric, and that for having the audacity to challenge this dogma of geocentrism, he was excommunicated and put under house arrest for the rest of his life. And it took until maybe like the time of Johannes Kepler, where it was just so obvious that the church had been wrong all this time, that finally they relented.
Yep.
What's the actual story there?
Yeah, that's largely wrong. I mean, certainly up until the late 17th century, the consensus amongst everyone, including scientists, was that the Earth was at the center of the cosmos. And this was not a purely religious and doctrinal idea. It was because it had been established since the ancient Greeks. So the Greeks looked at various cosmological models, but the one that became dominant was the geocentric model, which is sort of a synthesis between the physics of Aristotle and the astronomy of people like Hipparchus, and it was kind of put together by Ptolemy in the 2nd century AD. So Ptolemy's book, which we refer to by its Arabic name, the Almagest, was the textbook on astronomy from the 2nd century onwards, which meant that it was the textbook for medieval Christians as well. So it was very much the conception, which they didn't actually have the Almagest, a bit complicated. The conception of the Earth at the center, and that whole sort of synthesis of Aristotelian physics and Hipparchus's astronomy was standard. Now, the fact that the Bible seemed to indicate that the Earth was at the center as well was just sort of icing on the cake. But the main reason why that was widely accepted by almost everyone was that it had been established for over 1,000 years. The idea that anyone coming along and saying, well, there's another conception of this, there's another possibility, it could be that the sun is at the center, would have been immediately attacked by the Catholic Church, and that's what happened to Galileo. Well, that can be debunked pretty quickly, because Galileo didn't come up with the idea of heliocentrism, because Galileo was arguing for Copernicus's model, and Copernicus had been arguing for this throughout the whole of the previous century. So what often happens when I point this out to people is they say, "Oh, yeah, but Copernicus kept it a secret. He didn't publish his book until he was on his deathbed, and so he escaped the Inquisition by dying just as he released his book, and so that's how that worked." Well, that's complete garbage. Copernicus didn't keep it a secret. He'd been publicizing this idea since about at least 1520, and he released his book in 1543. But people had been talking about his theory for that whole period from 1520 right up to 1543, so 23 years. And when I say people, I mean prominent people in the church. So he was contacted by a Cardinal Schoenberg, who said, "I've heard you've got this really interesting theory. It sounds fascinating. Apparently, you're writing a book about it. Could you send me a copy? And if it would be too expensive for you to produce a copy, let me know and I'll pay for it myself." This is a cardinal of the Catholic Church who was clearly very interested in the idea, and obviously not threatened by it at all. But even more than that, the Pope Clement, had actually heard about Copernicus's theory via a student of Copernicus who was teaching about it in Rome. And so he invited this student, a guy called Johann Wittgenstein, to come and give a private lecture to himself and various cardinals and to the papal court in the Vatican
He wasn't
Gardens.
immediately seized by the
And the Pope,
Inquisition. Weird.
strangely enough, no. And the Pope was fascinated by the whole thing, and actually rewarded Wittgenstein with a valuable Greek manuscript, which is a bit like giving your guest speaker a Maserati. So he obviously, because that's how much it would have cost. So he obviously liked the idea. When the book was published in 1543, it was published not long after Copernicus died, well, not long before Copernicus died. The reaction was largely, well, this is very interesting, not this is terrible, we must burn this book. Now, a lot of people say, well, that's because Osiander, who was one of the publishers, put a preface on it saying this is just a hypothesis. It's not a statement of fact. Anyone who read the book could see that was not true, and it's pretty clear from commentary on it after its publication that everyone understood that it was meant to be. What we find, though, is that when people finally got to read the full mathematical basis for the Copernican model, they weren't convinced. And that's because there were some major problems with the model. The model actually worked quite well as a calculating device. So it meant that it was easier to calculate where the planets were going to be. And this is why the book actually was reasonably popular. But the parts of the book that were arguing that this is what's actually happening in the sky were, on the whole, were not widely highly regarded. And surveys of responses to Copernicanism from 1520 right up to the eve of the Galileo affair in say 1616 show that of all the thousands of scientists, all the thousands of astronomers and natural philosophers in Europe, probably only somewhere between 9 and 12 actually expressed a belief that Copernicus was right. So Galileo was championing a a fringe idea that most scientists rejected for scientific reasons. And this is something that a lot of people don't understand. The church had the consensus of science on its side, and it knew it. These guys weren't idiots. They were highly educated. They'd gone to university and studied
Right.
astronomy. They were following the debates about cosmology that were
In
happening
fact, the
in that
Catholic
period.
Church is still active in
And they knew
astronomy.
that.
There's an observatory near me where a number of the very large and very powerful telescopes are owned and operated by the Vatican.
Yeah, and they were right from the beginning. When Galileo was one of the first, not the first, but one of the first people to use the newly invented telescope to observe the heavens, and he made observations of the surface of the moon. Again, he wasn't the first to do that, but he was certainly the first to publicize it. He was very good at publicity. He was also a good artist, so his watercolor sketches of the moon are very accurate. But when he did that, the reaction of the Catholic Church was, "This is great. This is interesting. This is new knowledge." The idea that the Catholic Church in this period was opposed to science is another 19th century myth. They actually believed in what they call the two book doctrine. So they believed that there was the book of God, which is the Bible, obviously, but also the church fathers and various other patristic writers. But there was also the book of nature, and that both books, they believed, told the same story. They just told it in different ways. So they were very keen on the idea of understanding nature better, and they celebrated Galileo's discoveries. They honoured him with a banquet. They invited him to Rome. They gave him an honorary degree. But also what they'd done before this is they built their own telescopes, and the Collegium Romanum, which is basically the papal university, confirmed Galileo's findings. This is all good science. This is what you're meant to do. You're meant to check stuff. You're meant to make your own observations, repeatable experiments, and this is what they were doing. So why did Galileo get into trouble with the church? If everyone was happy, what's the problem? Well, what happened was Galileo had a tendency to kind of to overstep the mark. He wasn't a great diplomat. He was a bit of a socially awkward nerd, but he was also extremely arrogant and very full of his own opinions, even when they were wrong. So what he started to do is he started to venture into theology. He started to say, well, if the Copernican model is correct, which he, against the consensus, argued, then here's how we could reconcile that with these verses in the Bible. That sounds okay to us, but in the early 17th century, in the middle of the Counter-Reformation, in the wake of the Council of Trent, which had said you can't do that unless you are actually a qualified theologian, that was actually a very, very bad move. And so we've got letters where people are writing to Galileo, warning him, saying, "You need to calm down with this stuff because you're ruffling feathers politically." Galileo was not good at calming down when he thought he was right. And so what happened is in 1616, the Inquisition formed a commission of inquiry. It wasn't a trial, and it wasn't specifically aimed at Galileo, but they made a ruling on this whole heliocentrism thing. So they said they consulted the scientists, and they said, okay, it's scientifically wrong. So this is why the ruling they made starts by saying it's absurd in philosophy. That means scientifically wrong in our language. And then there's a semicolon, and then they say, and contrary to Holy Scripture, and therefore formally heretical. Formally heretical doesn't actually mean it's heresy. A lot of people get confused by that. The Inquisition couldn't declare something to be heretical, and heliocentrism was never declared to be actually heretical. But formally heretical kind of means heresy adjacent, a little bit too close to heresy for our comfort. So what they were basically saying was, if you're going to present this as a fact, you're sailing very, very dangerously close to heretical, and we're telling you you can't do that. So that was the ruling that they made. You can't state this as a fact. They then summoned Galileo because he was one of the people who'd been doing this, and said to him, you've got to understand this is the ruling that we've made. And he agreed. He said, okay, I'm not going to do that. That was in 1616. What happened then was the Pope died, and the new Pope was a friend of Galileo's. And Galileo, not surprisingly, thought, well, okay, that means maybe things have changed. The new pope was also very interested in science and astronomy, and he encouraged Galileo to write a book which compared the various models that were around at the time, but to do so in a way that was even-handed and that presented the arguments for and against each. Keep in mind there were 7 competing models. So a lot of people think that there were just 2. There was the geocentric model of Ptolemy and the heliocentric model of Copernicus. But there was also the Keplerian model, you mentioned Kepler before, which Galileo completely ignored. There was the Tychonian model, which actually by that stage looked like the one that made most sense. It fitted most of the evidence, and most of the scientists at the time actually held to the Tychonian model. Tychonian model was geohelio. So it said that the Earth is at the center, the sun goes around the Earth, and all the other planets go around the sun. It sounds crazy to us, but it actually fitted the observations and the physics of the time much better.
Actually, that's
pre-Newton, so they had to try and reconcile it.
That's one thing I want
to
to make a note of real quick is that the reason that the scientists weren't generally on Galileo's side is because other models made better predictions. That's what you want in science. Exactly. Galileo's model wasn't it was easy to make the predictions. It was easier to make them, but they were less accurate. So
So what happened then was Galileo wrote his dialogue concerning the 2 world systems. Now, the title, which should indicate that what he didn't do was what he was supposed to do, which was compare all of the models that were available. He just compared the one that was already pretty much debunked, that was the Ptolemaic model, and the one that he liked, the Copernican model, and he ignored all the others. He then did something a little bit sneaky, because you had to get your book past the censors. This is across the whole of Europe, Catholic or Protestant, anywhere. The authorities had to give you permission to publish a book. So he wrote to the censor in Rome and said, the censor in Florence says that it's okay for me to publish this book. And then he wrote to the censor in Florence and said, censor in Rome says it's okay for me to publish this book. And both of them then said, oh, yeah, that's fine. So he then went to his publishers and said, oh, I've got permission. When the book came out, it caused quite a scandal, because it obviously was arguing quite clearly for Copernicanism. And unfortunately, this happened at exactly the wrong time politically for Galileo, because the Pope was under pressure. He was seen by some more conservative factions, particularly within the Catholic Church, particularly the Spanish factions, as being too lax, too forgiving of radical new ideas. And he was this upstart mathematicus, this lowest of the low in the academic hierarchy, popping up, who had already been cautioned about dabbling in theology, popping up and presenting this book with this radical minority thesis that most scientists said was wrong, and holding it up as being true, after having agreed in 1616 not to do that. So he fell from papal favour, and he was hauled before the Inquisition, and they were going to make an example of him. He, being Galileo, was given several opportunities to kind of back down and to avoid the whole thing, but he was convinced that he was right and that he could argue his case. He had what he thought was a killer argument, which was his argument from the tides. The argument from the tides is completely wrong, and we know it now, but they knew it then. But he refused to see that he got the basics of how tides work wrong. And he marched into the trial expecting to be able to grandstand and present his theory, and was pretty quickly cut down to size. You can see the point in the transcript where he realizes that he's going to get found guilty, because he kind of was. He had agreed not to do this, and he'd done it. I'm not saying what happened to him was good, and of course it was a suppression of freedom of speech and all that stuff, but that stuff didn't exist in the early 17th century. Those are much later ideas. The idea that any academic should be able to believe or argue anything they want, not in Renaissance Italy in the early
that's 17th. A very modern kind of thing to impose back on that period, which it's easy for us to do, is to impose our current values, but you can't actually expect history to care about your modern values.
It's a historiographical fallacy called presentism, which is like, well, we think this, therefore they should have thought that, and if they didn't think that, then they are bad. And you can't do history that way. You've got to work from the mores and understandings of the time. At no point did Galileo stand up in the Inquisition and say, "You don't have the right to infringe on my
Right.
free thought." He would never, because it would,
Yeah,
wouldn't
that's
it
not even
never
a
have
sentence that
occurred
would
to him.
make sense.
No, not at all. But so he then had to quickly backpedal and sort of say, well, it's all a bit of a misunderstanding. And now I've reread my book. I can sort of see why you might think that perhaps I was saying that heliocentrism is true,
No.
which didn't fool anyone. And then he got found guilty, not surprisingly. Then they sentenced him to imprisonment, which was actually a pretty strong sentence. He got commuted to house arrest, and he died. I think it was eight years later. The part of the myth, though, is that this sort of set back science by a long time in Catholic countries and so on. There's absolutely no evidence for that at all. What did happen, though, was that people over the course of the next century started to continue to look at the evidence, and right into the middle or even towards the three-quarters of the way into the 17th century, the Tychonian model, which was not heliocentric, was still the most prominent. What started to happen was people started to realize that Kepler's model was actually really good for calculating what was going on in the heavens. And they found not just easy, it was
Right.
good, it was accurate. And that's because it was the one that was actually
Right.
closest to being true. The reason people like Galileo and everyone else had rejected Kepler for so long is that he couldn't get his head around the idea of
Yeah, everyone thought everything in the heavens was going in circles or spheres. Because
be
it's
a circle.
perfect.
Yep, had to be a perfect form. Also, the planets and so on seem to be spheres. So spheres and circles seem to make sense. Spheres and ellipses didn't. But what happened was that Kepler's model was much more accurate. And then along came Newton, and Newton provided the physics behind what's going on with Kepler's three laws of planetary motion, and that kind of clinched it. That really wasn't until the consensus didn't really change until the late 17th, early 18th century. So when did the Catholic Church get around to kind of admitting that they'd kind of got it wrong? They'd backed the wrong horse. Lots of people say it happened in 1992, where the Pope John Paul II gave a speech that sort of apologised for what they did to Galileo. That's not true. That's actually a result of some fairly bad journalism at that point. What John Paul II did was he commissioned a kind of an inquiry into what the Galileo affair says about the relationship between theology and science. And he then gave a very learned, actually a very, very interesting speech about that, which just assumed that, of course, Galileo was right. But the journalists who were present probably got a bit lost in the
Yeah.
theology and wrote it up as, oh, yeah, Pope apologizes for Galileo, finally admits that Galileo was wrong. They'd taken Galileo's books off the banned list like centuries before. They just didn't make a big song and dance about it because it was a bit embarrassing. So the Galileo affair is another example of the caricature of Galileo, noble hero of science, the church, ignorant, superstitious idiots who wouldn't look through his telescope, and they were wrong and he was right, and all that stuff. And he was a wise and noble hero, and they were evil and ignorant. Total nonsense. That's not the case. But again, the real story is much more interesting, even if the real story doesn't lend itself to moral fable.
Once
the way
again,
the
we tend not to
caricature
have
is.
true villains or true heroes in actual history.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I quite like Galileo as a guy. I think he was quite an interesting fellow. But you'd invite him to dinner parties because he was very funny, and he was very witty, and he was very intelligent. But he was also extremely
Right.
arrogant and stubborn, and could be a bit of a troll. He was quite a bit of a bastard to his opponents in a very funny way. But was he a noble hero? No, he was a flawed human being like
Yeah.
everyone else.
And I think that's one of the things that you can get from history that's outside of things like how socioeconomic forces interact with society. When you get it down to like an individual human level, one of the things you realize is, yeah, people are flawed individuals all through history. We all make our mistakes, and sometimes it works out for the good, and sometimes it doesn't.
Not so much.
So let's
Yeah,
see. There
exactly.
was another. Oh, right. You're familiar with the chart. Yes. So For those people who might not know in the
Yeah.
audience, there's this graph, although calling it a graph is generous because you can't actually graph what it purports to graph, where it has scientific progress on the y-axis, and it's going up in a little steady, maybe accelerating fashion, and then it hits the Christian Dark Ages, and it falls off a cliff, and then only at the Enlightenment does scientific advancement start again, and then there's this big chunk labeled the hole left by the Christian Dark Ages. Now, I think we all recognize, for one thing, you cannot put scientific advancement on a graph because there's no numbers that you can apply to it. What is 3 units of scientific advancement? I don't know. No one knows. So it's automatically beyond stupid to put something like that on a graph. But let's talk about the actual idea behind it, because what's being portrayed is that we have this general advance in human knowledge, and that around the time of the fall of the Western Roman Empire, which is usually when most people start saying the Dark Ages start, scientific advancement, apparently for the entire human race, because apparently only Western Europe had scientific advancement, just goes down to essentially zero. We're at the same point basically as like the Neolithic, which is weird because we didn't actually go back to the Neolithic, which the chart would imply, and then only finally in the Renaissance does anyone in humanity ever once again have scientific progress. And I am very confident, given my minor in Renaissance and medieval studies, that is complete nonsense. But let's have you talk about it because you're the guest.
Sure. So the chart, as it's been called the chart by the Reddit subreddit called Bad History. And Bad History is quite an amusing group, and they have a lot of fun with things like the chart. They called it the chart. The chart was originally put together by a guy called Jim Walker for a website called nobeliefs.com, which doesn't seem to be up and running these days. But it's a pretty common trope, this idea that science and technology were advancing quite happily under the Greeks and the Romans, and then along came Christianity, and they destroyed all scientific learning and plunged us into a dark age. And it wasn't until the Reformation and the Renaissance that ancient Greek and Roman knowledge was rediscovered and we got back on track. And if the Christians hadn't have done this, then we would all be living on, I don't know, the moons of Jupiter or something. And so it set us back by 1,000 years, blah, blah, blah. It's such a common idea, actually, that on the comedy cartoon, The Family Guy, there's one bit where Stewie and Brian find themselves in what looks like a futuristic world. And Stewie says, "Are we in the future?" And Brian explains, "No, this is our world, but in an alternative reality where Christianity didn't destroy ancient Greek and Roman science." Right? And the whole point of that joke is that everyone understands that that's what happens. That's what actually happened. That's not what happened. I mean, as you point out, the idea that what happened in Western Europe to begin with is the whole of the world.
It's amazingly Eurocentric.
Yeah, exactly. So there's the first problem. The second problem with it is it falls into the fallacy of post hoc ergo propter hoc. So something happened at this point, and something happened after that, and therefore the first thing happened. Second thing happened as a result of the first thing. So we got the rise of Christianity in, let's say, the 4th century. We were talking about Constantine before, and then we have the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century. Then we have what is often referred to as the Dark Ages, and then we have, later on we have the Renaissance. And the problem with this is, yes, there was a decline in Western Europe in the period from about the 5th century, actually began in about the 3rd century, right through to really about the 10th century. The idea of the whole of the Middle Ages, right up to the 15th century, was a dark age is completely wrong. So that's the first problem with the next problem with the chart. It has this hole that goes all the way from about like the 4th century right through to the 15th. Well, that's ridiculous. Yes, there was a decline though in the fifth, from the 5th to say, let's say, about somewhere between the 8th and the 10th century, but that was because the Roman Empire collapsed. So when your civilization collapses, then you tend to have things happen such as a loss of technical knowledge, a loss of a degrading and massive decline in education, and people being much more interested in things like fighting off waves of barbarians than maybe sitting and solving some of the mathematical problems of
It's kind of a
Archimedes.
hierarchy of needs.
That's
When
what.
your worries are starving or being killed by
Yeah, kind of.
bandits,
Yeah.
things like philosophy kind of take a backseat, guys.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a lot of scholarly debate about the impact of the fall of the Roman Empire and so on. But what we can say is that there was a decline in long distance trade, in education, and in major building works. So, for example, people forgot how to make concrete. A lot of people say, well, how could they have forgotten how to make concrete? And I have people say it must have been because the church banned concrete. Why did the church ban concrete? Why would concrete
The Catholic Church
evil?
is made up of
But
people,
the
right?
reason
Like, they're not just weird, perverse monsters who want to ban all the good things ever.
Yeah, apparently they are. So why did they forget concrete? Well, because concrete was used to make major monumental works, huge buildings that required a massive tax base of an entire empire, and also required millions, literally millions of slaves. Something like a quarter of the population of the Roman Empire was enslaved. So when the Roman Empire collapsed, and for various economic reasons, slavery declined, and you didn't have this huge tax base. In fact, you didn't have a tax base at all. The tax system fell apart as well. There was just no one who could build buildings like that.
Yeah,
And
if
so
no
people
one
forgot
if
how.
no one needs to make
Not too
concrete
surprisingly,
for generations, then
it's sacred.
how you can remember?
Exactly.
Like,
Yeah.
no one's going to keep the
Yeah.
secret of concrete alive through the ages. Like, come here, grandson, I'm going to tell you the secret of concrete that might come in handy 300 years from now. Like, that's not
One
a
day.
thing.
Yeah. When the Renaissance comes. So yes, there was a decline in a lot of things in Western Europe, specifically in Western Europe in that period. It was because of the collapse of the Roman Empire. And the argument that, oh, well, it must have been also because of Christianity. Well, then they have to explain
Right,
the
which
Eastern
had no
Roman
Dark
Empire.
Age.
Because the Western Roman, that's right. So the Western Roman Empire collapsed, and yeah, there was a Dark Age of a kind in the West. The Eastern Roman Empire was just as Christian as the West. It continued for another 1,000 years, and it built amazing buildings like the Hagia Sophia and these huge domed churches. It had a series of highly of schools of highly technical thought. All of the ancient Roman and Greek philosophical classics and so on that we have today were preserved there, and we have them as a result of them being preserved there. They'll pass back to the West from there by the Arabs, but they were preserved by Christians. And so the idea that Christianity caused the Dark Ages, well, I would say, okay, so why didn't it cause the Eastern Roman
Right, they
Empire
maintained all the
never
monumental
get an
building, the record keeping. They had trade connections as far as China, which, I mean, it's hard to get much farther east than China when you're trading from, the Asia Minor. In fact, actually,
That's right.
the Chinese bought what they called Roman silk because when they sent over their silk to Rome, there were Roman weavers who would work with it to make fancy patterns and even finer cloth. And so the Romans had a trade secret that they didn't actually have silkworms. They had to keep that hushed up. Because if the Chinese found out that they were the only ones producing silk, well, maybe they'd figure out how to produce this Roman silk. And so you have this whole international trade network with state secrets and things, all going on during the supposed Dark Ages involving Christians. And in fact, even when you get to places like India and China, there were native Christian populations who weren't from Europe. They weren't from, Asia Minor. They were people who had been Christians in these countries for centuries, who themselves actually had their own branches of universities and things. And you get Nestorian Christianity in China being imperial advisors and things like this. There really isn't a global history of Christianity being a retrograde force in the sciences and literature and whatnot.
Exactly. And the other problem with the Dark Age, the idea that the Middle Ages were a Dark Age, that from the 10th century through to the 15th century, what you see is a complete reversal of what had happened in that earlier medieval period. So the period of decline and collapse from the 5th century onwards, which wasn't just the falling apart of the political collapse of the Roman Empire. It was also the impact on the early 6th century of what's called the Plague of Justinians, or massive pandemic bubonic plague, which depopulated large chunks of Europe, which is why you see cities like Rome, which had a population of 1 million people, dwindle to about 20,000, which is why Rome's in ruins. Basically everyone died. And then you had things like climate change, so that the early medieval period was much colder and wetter, and that then reversed. So in the later medieval period, you had this sort of warm period, and you had a boom in later medieval Europe. You also had a revival of science. So the idea that didn't happen until the Renaissance of the 15th and 16th century. Actually, the humanist scholars of the 15th and 16th century weren't very interested in science. They liked poetry. They were very interested in plays and histories, but the scientific stuff had been rediscovered back in the 12th century. And the influence of via the Arabic world, so via Arabic Spain, but ultimately from the Byzantine Empire, the influx of this lost Greek learning, which had been lost in the period due to the decline of Greek literacy in the period before, stimulated intellectual activity in medieval Europe, and happened to come about at the same time with the rise of the universities. The universities then set up this infrastructure of knowledge building on knowledge, of shared knowledge across a network of institutions, which remains to this day. When you and I have been to universities, it's a medieval institution, and that actually had a very significant. That laid the foundations of things like of the scientific revolution in the 16th and 17th centuries. The other thing that we find in the late medieval period is some quite a remarkable technical innovation. So I remember back in 2000, there were a lot of lists in magazines about the most important X of the millennium.
Yes, I remember that.
And remember those? There was one about one a week, the most important songs of the millennium and so on. They were all songs from the 20th century, strangely enough.
Weird, isn't it? It's almost like presentness bias happens. Guys, here's a hint. If it hasn't been at least as long since the time period as you're talking about as that time period, you're probably not in a position to say what the most significant part of that time period was.
Yeah, true. But one of these lists was the most important inventions, and I think it was in human history. And it was interesting that how many of them were from the Middle Ages, from the European Middle Ages. So these things, eyeglasses, invented in the Middle Ages. Imagine what I wouldn't be able to read properly. It'd be very difficult, and many people wouldn't be able to see or function at all without this medieval invention. The printing press is also a medieval invention. The clock is a medieval invention. The Greeks and Romans had water clocks and so on. There was a Chinese mechanical clock, which was about 3 stories tall and needed an army of people to keep it running. But mechanical clocks were invented in the late 13th century, and very quickly became extremely complex. So you had clocks that were effectively astronomical computers that ran through dozens of calculations, everything from the tides to the phases of the moon, the movements of the planets. And then they went from mainframe, those really, really big clocks, to desktop, ones that you could literally put on your desk in the space of about a century and a half. And the ancestors, the clock is the ancestor of pretty much all of our information technology, including the computer that we're talking through now. Again, a medieval invention. Effective gunpowder weapons. Chinese invented gunpowder. They did have gunpowder weapons with medieval Europeans who were good at killing people, who worked out how to use them to kill people. So you went from gunpowder being introduced in the late 13th century, being refined, and particularly corned powder being developed in medieval Europe in the 14th century, and revolutionizing the battlefield in the 15th and 16th. So the Middle Ages actually, the idea of it as a dark age doesn't make any sense. In the 11th century, you had a monk in Malmesbury Abbey called Aylmer, and he was an astronomer. He liked looking up at the sky, but he was looking at the way birds flew, and he thought, I think I can do that. So he built a flying machine. We don't know what it looked like. Probably a glider. Had it dragged to the top of the Abbey church, climbed into it,
That's
and
a
launched
lot
himself
of confidence.
off. And he flew. He flew the distance of about sort of 4 or 5 football fields before he crashed into a tree and broke both his legs. But it was a successful experiment in man flight, smack bang in the middle of the so-called
Yeah.
Dark Ages. So whenever anyone talks to me about the Middle Ages being a dark age, I say, well, why is a period that saw the invention of astronomical computers, that saw the development of the mean speed theorem, of logarithmic expression, and a successful experiment in manned flight, a dark age? The other problem is the church was at its weakest in the early medieval period and very much at its strongest in the late period. But where we see the decline in technology and scientific understanding was in the early period, and where we see its blossoming and revival is in the late. It should
Yeah,
be
if
the
the
other way
thesis is
around.
accurate that
So
Christianity is the depressing
yeah,
force, then yeah, it should be the late period that's worse.
yeah, and that's not the case. So the chart, but more importantly, the cliche behind it is completely wrong, and it's based on a very deep-seated, largely anti-Catholic prejudice against the Middle Ages. And as a medievalist, I find it really frustrating that people have this Hollywood idea of the Middle Ages as dirty, ignorant, stupid, backward, and it was actually nothing like that. They did wash,
That's
for
true.
example. Their streets weren't full of crap. They didn't throw their crap out the window into the street. All this stuff are myths, but try and get people to
Yeah,
understand them.
it's tough because there are so many popular narratives about these times, and I think part of it is that it makes it easy. If you can summarize a period of history in like 2 sentences, then that's easy to understand. But the problem is that, as I think we both know, that no period of history could be adequately summarized that quickly and then give you an actual idea. So at this point, I'm going to start opening it up to audience questions. So if you do have a question for Tim here, please do tag Dapper Dinosaur so that way it appears. If we do have any super chats, that will come first. And while we wait for any questions to come in, we'll keep chatting about history and things. So I generally am of the opinion that it's hard to actually assess a net effect of any one religion on things like the advancement of science. What's your take on that?
Well, people often ask me about Christianity. A lot of people say, "Do you think Christianity was, overall good or bad for humanity? Do you think it has been overall good or bad?" And I always say, "How the hell do you measure that? I mean, good or bad by what measure? Can I point to good things that Christianity has done? Yes, I can certainly point to good things that individual Christians have done. But can I point to good things that Christianity, good things that we see as good that Christianity has done? Yeah, I probably could. But it gets a little bit difficult when you're trying to come up with an objective way to say, well, that is good, because maybe what we see as good is going to, in 500 years' time, is going to be seen to be as bizarre or as bad. But the other problem is, well, how do you measure the net evil of an institution? Again, I can point to many evil things that Christianity has done, and certainly point to, in some detail, to evil things that Christians have done. But this whole idea that you can by some metric, and it gets back to
how do
the
you
chart,
get that y-axis?
and
It's
it's why,
nonsense.
yeah, exactly. I mean, the bad history subreddit has already defined what the unit of scientific advancement is. Apparently, it's the Sagan, and there's a big debate about how exactly you measure Sagans. It's and the subunit is the DeGrasse Tyson. So it can be done, apparently.
We have a question from JS. How quickly did the various European pagan religions, Roman, Celtic, Germanic, Norse, Slavic, Finnish, Baltic, etc., die out with the arrival of Christianity in those areas?
Yeah, it kind of depends. As I mentioned before, with Greco-Roman traditional, what we call paganism, it was a pretty slow evolution rather than sort of a sudden cataclysm. And the idea that Christians were rampaging around persecuting pagans and so on, I've come across people who try and argue that, and that's largely nonsense. What happened was that people coexisted for several generations. On the whole, though, it was the the upper echelons of society that were slowest to adopt Christianity. The emperors did, but the levels below them, the senatorial class, stayed pagan for about, as I think I mentioned before, right into the 6th century. But I think the thing that we need to keep in mind is that the whole conception of religion is actually a very modern thing. We actually didn't come up with the concept of religion until the 18th century. It's very much something that the Enlightenment invented. So if you went back and asked someone in, let's say, 3rd century Rome, what's your religion? They wouldn't know what you're talking about. Religio was basically the right way in which to honor the divine. So it was a matter of practice. So what is your religio? What was the way in which you honor the divine? Well, people would talk to you about the practices
The
that they
sacrifices, the
engage in.
prayers.
And yeah, so sacrifice or offering incense on an altar, or Christians, it would be prayer, it would be the communal Eucharistic meal, and so on. And there would have been some people who practiced both. There was certainly some overlap, particularly in the second, third, fourth, even into the 5th century. There would have been people who kind of worshipped Jesus
Yeah.
as a god,
Actually,
but still
that
honored
gets
the
into one
other
of my
gods as
favorite
well.
kind of artifacts that you can find, which are things like magical inscriptions or amulets or papyri. And often these things, they're basically like good luck charms or bad luck charms in some cases, for cursing people. They frequently invoke Egyptian, Greek, Roman, and Christian religious concepts all in the same sentence. They'll say, "Oh, by the power of Thoth and Horus and Zeus and Jesus." It's like, you got to cover all your bases, man. You never know which of the gods is going to really pick up that curse. And so, yeah, there's a whole lot of syncretism that happens that I think people, I think even especially Christians, don't like to think about. They don't like to think about people who might call themselves Christians invoking, Zeus to help them out in a bind by writing down a magical spell. Because
Yeah, and I think Christians have a bit of a mythic view of their own history as well. Where it was all very pure and clean, and everyone believed back then what Christians believe today about about the nature of Jesus and so on. When you go back to the 2nd century, there's some wild stuff being written about Jesus. Jesus, killing people,
killing his buddies and then
Jesus,
resurrecting them.
yeah, that's right. And Jesus appearing as a 15-foot tall talking cross, and there's some really crazy stuff. But back to the question. In other parts of Europe, it was kind of the same. But one of the things we have to remember is that because as I was saying before, they didn't have an idea of religion
Right.
as a set of beliefs. They had more of an idea of what we'd call orthopraxis, so how you practice in order to honor the divinity or divine in the world. This meant that their religious practice was very communal. We have this idea of religion as being a very individual thing, and again, that's a very modern, very post-Enlightenment sort of an idea. It's a set of beliefs that's personal to me. It's my business. It's not the state's business. It's not necessarily the church's business. It's all about me and what I believe up here in my head. In the ancient and large, and particularly in the medieval world, but in the ancient world especially as well, it was much more about how do we communally do things to honor the divine. And this meant that when a leader converted, quite often okay, we're now Christians, right? So we're not honoring those gods anymore. We're now honoring this God. Now, there would have been some, we know there were some people who sort of went, well, I don't want to do that. I still want to worship Thor. But on the whole, because this religious practice was communal, once the king, the chief, or whatever said, okay, now we're throwing down those idols and we're putting up this cross, that's kind of what people did. And we have good evidence of that. We also have evidence of of Christianity existing alongside what we refer to as paganism. So you were talking before about artifacts. There's a mold that was found in, I believe it was in Sweden, that has where a jewelry maker would pour silver or bronze or whatever into this mold to make ornaments. And on one side is a Christian cross, and on the other side is a Thor's hammer. So he was catering to,
Yeah.
to both sides. And we've also got descriptions in the Viking sagas of guys who say, well, I worship the white Christ when I'm at home, but for sea voyages, I still pray to the old gods, because I don't know if that Christ guy is really good at sea voyages, so I still pray to Thor when I
Yeah.
go out onto the sea. So it was a transition. Some of the you mentioned the Baltic area. The Baltic area remained pagan right into the early modern period, and there's actually quite an interesting period area to study, because most of our sources for other earlier forms of Northern European paganism are pretty fragmentary,
Yeah.
and they're largely Christian. The Baltic ones are largely Christian as well, but they're much closer to us in time, so we get a much better idea of what was happening there. The other thing about the Baltic area was it was conquered and converted largely by force. So the Teutonic Knights and a mob called the Sword Brethren basically imposed Christianity by force, but mostly across Western Europe. That wasn't the case. It was more a matter of people turning up and saying, "Well, here's a new idea," and some people saying, "Actually, we quite like this new idea," and adopting it. It was reasonably peaceful
Yeah.
most of the time.
That is actually one thing, and I think it might come up here. So TD Lane asks, what is the biggest misconception regarding the medieval Europe that has been covered in Tim's opinion? And adjacent to that, I think one of the big ones is that, for me, is that Christianity was primarily spread through Europe by basically telling people who would rather not be Christians that they had to or die, which is not generally the case
Yes.
for the European kind of conversion to Christianity. Right.
There's examples, and I just mentioned the Baltic
Not unheard of, but
Crusades, which
not the
were
norm.
basically war. Yeah, the other one is Charlemagne's war against the Saxons in the 8th century and into the 9th century, where effectively it was convert or die. But that was pretty rare. Biggest misconception about the Middle Ages, well, probably the one I mentioned before about people not washing, which is just ridiculous. They washed every day, they had baths, they loved baths, they had bathhouses. But that's the myth that just will never die. But I think, just still on medieval religion, there is this idea, and it's probably as common amongst particularly Catholics as it is amongst non-believers, that the Catholic Church was this all-powerful
Right.
theocracy. It's a very Protestant idea that effectively everyone was under the thumb of the Catholic Church. That the Pope effectively was a theocratic ruler who ruled like the Ayatollah
Not even
Khomeini
close.
in Iran. Yeah, and he and everyone was afraid of the church, and the church dominated everyone's lives. And the Inquisition was sort of like this Gestapo. It had an office on every corner, and if you so much as thought about maybe something scientific, you were immediately burned as a heretic. And it was nothing like that. As I mentioned before, in the early medieval period, the Catholic Church was actually quite weak, because what had happened was the Western Roman Empire collapsed, and their former patron and sponsor, the Roman Emperor, was gone, and suddenly they were at the mercy of these fragmentary Germanic barbarian kingdoms, the kings of whom were largely in the south, at least, so in places like Italy, Ostrogothic Italy, Visigothic Spain, Vandal Africa, were Christians, but they were Arian Christians, so they were the wrong type of Christians. So that put the Catholic Church on the back foot. In the north of Europe, in what's now France, or in northern Gaul, and in Britain, and in the Rhineland, the new rulers were all pagans. So the Catholic Church in that early period was extremely weak, and eventually managed to, once the kings of Francia converted to Christianity, eventually managed to get them to be their kind of like their new sponsors. But on the whole, what that meant was the church had to hitch its wagon to secular rulers for protection. And what that meant was that the secular rulers treated the church like its plaything. So if you had a bishop die, then the local secular lord could say, well, okay, my cousin will now be bishop. And so the church was slowly being taken over by what we would call state. And then there was a series of reform movements in the 9th, 10th, and 11th centuries, which were very much about the church trying to take back its own destiny and push back against the secular domination that had dominated it for the previous 500 years. So what you get is this conflict between, it's called the church-state conflict, from the 10th century right up to the Reformation, where the church is constantly struggling for independence and the state is trying to keep the church under control. And this meant that at no point was the church a theocracy. At no point was the church able to call the shots. Occasionally, it could manage to marshal some forces behind it and excommunicate a king. But that was pretty rare. And on the whole, the whole conception of that people have from the Protestant Reformation of the Pope as all powerful and so on is largely a myth, but it's largely a reflection of the success that the church finally had in the later part, the last 2 or 3 centuries of the medieval period. For most of the medieval period, it wasn't a dominant. It was a political force, but it wasn't the dominant political force. Also, the idea that everyone was devout and everyone was going to church all the time and so on. Again, that's largely a late medieval thing. In the early Middle Ages, people might go to church once a year. The Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 passed a rule that said you must go to church at least once a year.
At least.
Right? And I found that very difficult to enforce. So what then happened was that they realized that most people actually didn't have a terribly good grasp of their faith at all. They were Christians, but it was a bit of a kind of a folk peasant version of Christianity. And so they began things like the preaching movements of the Franciscan and Dominican friars, and they began to really push the idea of lay piety, and people took it up. In the 14th, particularly in the 15th century, lay piety really. So what I mean by that is the average person actually taking their faith seriously, actually going to church regularly, actually praying every day. That started to become quite popular, and people began to take examine their religion much more closely. One of the things that came out of that was the Reformation. So the Reformation was actually a result of the Catholic Church managing to get people to take
after like 1,000 years of trying.
Exactly. So that was kind of ironic. But the idea that the Inquisition was lurking on every corner. The Inquisition wasn't even founded until the 13th century. So it was only around in the last 300 years of the medieval period. And most parts of Europe, if you'd ask them, I'd ask them about the Inquisition, they wouldn't know what you were talking about, because it wasn't an institution, it was a process. It was a kind of a type of inquiry that was set up locally by a bishop if there was a fear that a heretical idea was taking hold in a particular community. And the idea that anyone hauled before the Inquisition was tortured until they confessed and then burnt at the stake.
There were a lot of acquittals at the Inquisition.
Well, most people, 85% to 90% of people who were questioned by the Inquisition were acquitted. And then the ones who were found guilty of some kind of heretical belief were basically given the instruction, told not to do it again, given a penance and let go. You had to work pretty hard to get executed by the Inquisition. Basically, you had to effectively be a relapsed heretic who sort of said, you know what, I said I wasn't going to believe this anymore, but I still do, so, yah to you. And or you had to be a heretical leader who was just blatant about the fact that they were defying the Catholic Church. Now, I don't think burning people alive, let me stress this, I don't think burning people alive for their beliefs is a good thing anyway. But yeah, on the whole, I don't think that's a good thing. But the myths about the Inquisition, the Hollywood idea that in every medieval court there was some fat evil bishop, whispering about this person might be a witch and let's burn them. That just wasn't the case. Witches is another one, by the way. The witch craze was not a medieval phenomenon. It was an early modern phenomenon. Yet you always hear about the witch burnings of the Middle Ages, even though the Catholic Church's position on witches for almost all of the Middle Ages, right up to the 15th century, was that witches didn't exist, and that they were a peasant superstition, and that you were actually a bad person if you believed in witches. Now that changed for complicated reasons in the 15th century. But for some reason, you don't hear about the witch craze or the witch burnings of the
Yeah,
Renaissance, or the witch burnings of the
right.
Enlightenment. But
In
that's
fact,
when
that's
they
even when
happen.
the famous American witch trials happen, which I don't know how famous they are internationally, but having grown up, like 20 miles from where a number of people were burned for witchcraft, I heard a lot about them. But yeah, they were in, the
Yeah,
modern period. I mean, we were talking about
the
like,
Salem
the
ones.
1600s. So,
Yeah. No one was burned in
oh
Massachusetts,
yeah,
though.
that's true.
That's another myth.
They're
They,
hanged. That's true.
they were hanged. So no one was burned for witchcraft in
Although
England either. It was the
I don't
execution
consider that much
was
of a
hanged.
solace.
No, that's true. Though I think if given the choice
Yeah,
between burned alive and
yeah,
hanged,
I'll
then I
take
would
the
go
hanging, but it's one of those like, if I have to be in that situation, then yes, I have a preference. My actual preference is that just not
yeah,
happen. Let's just get out of that territory.
yeah,
Um, so
yeah,
yeah, it is interesting that this sort of early modern phenomenon is just projected back, and in fact, we even get that outside of like Christian and atheist circles. You'll find, for instance, Wiccans like to pretend that they are the surviving inheritors of this witchcraft religion that was suppressed in the Middle Ages with all these witch burnings, and it's like none of that's historically true.
no,
That's not a thing that happened.
yeah. Yes, the Wiccan religion is one of the most recent religions
Yeah.
in human history. In fact, Ronald Hutton, who's the great historian of paganism, both ancient and modern, says that Wicca is the one religion that has been given to the world by England, because it effectively
Hmm.
grew out of sort of Edwardian esoteric beliefs. But yeah, I think I mean modern neo-pagans get very angry with me as well, because I write articles on how actually no, most Christmas traditions are not
Actually,
originally pagan, and no, Halloween was not
that's actually.
originally pagan.
I think
They're
that's going.
Christian. I'm
It's
sorry,
going to be our. I think that's
but
going to
they
be our
are.
last topic. Um, could you go into some of the things like, is Easter actually based on the celebration of a fertility goddess from Mesopotamia? Which, by the way, I love that because it only really works as an argument in English. In basically every other language, which,
Yes,
spoiler alerts, many Christians don't speak English, and it wasn't the foundation like language of any Christian texts. Yeah, they all don't call
yeah.
Easter by anything like that. They all call it some variety of Pascha, which is just Greek for Passover. But yeah, could we talk about a few of those
Like
things?
someone. Sure, it's like someone I came across on TikTok the other day that was arguing, and they thought this was a really powerful argument, that Jesus is called the Son of God, but it was originally the Son, S-U-N, of God, and
Oh
because he
my!
was a solar deity. It's
Oh,
like, well, did you think people in ancient Egypt, ancient Greece, and ancient Rome were
yeah.
speaking English?
Spoiler alerts. If your argument is based on a pun in
Still,
English,
still,
it doesn't work any earlier than
yeah,
like maybe the 1600s if you're
yeah.
speaking contemporary English. It's not going to work, guys.
So Easter is not derived from Ishtar. That's the one you're referring to there. So Ishtar was a ancient Sumerian and Babylonian goddess, and there's this meme that goes around every Easter, that Easter was originally Ishtar, and was originally stolen by the Christians, and she was a fertility goddess, and her symbols were bunnies and eggs. And this is why we have Easter bunny and Easter eggs and so on. That's all crap. First of all, Ishtar wasn't a fertility goddess. Her symbols were the lion and the star. There's no connection between bunnies and eggs and Ishtar. And the name Easter has got nothing to do with Ishtar. It kind of sounds similar in English, but yeah, as you just mentioned, Tim, the origin of the name of Easter in English is about the only vaguely pagan thing about it. It was named after a goddess, but not a Sumerian one. It was a Germanic goddess, an Anglo-Saxon goddess called Eostra, about whom we know absolutely nothing other than she existed. So she's mentioned in one reference in a book called De Ratione Temporum by the monk, the Venerable Bede, writing in the 7th century, 8th century. And he wrote a book on, the book was about how to calculate time. how to measure and calculate calendars, and also how to calculate the date of Easter, which was a fairly important thing in the medieval period. And so he goes through the names of the months in Old English, which was his language, and he explains what they all mean. And one of those months was a month that corresponded roughly to like March, early April, was Eastramonath, which means the month of Easter. And he says that this is because there was a goddess called Aestra, and they had festivals for her in that month. Full stop. That's all he says. So you often get people saying, well, she was a fertility goddess and she was a sex goddess, and there would have been orgies, and her symbols were eggs and bunnies. Again, no, there's absolutely no evidence. There's no reference other than that one I just mentioned to her.
I would like a citation for all those claims.
Yeah, exactly. And whenever I ask people on Twitter for them, I can never get them. They just get angry with me and say you're just denying.
Yeah, well, you are, for good reason.
Yeah, because there aren't any. So why do we call it Easter? Well, that's because it falls in around about the time that was generally referred to as Eastramonath, and it kind of got shortened to Easter. But does it fall on the festival of this goddess? Well, we don't know. Probably not. We don't know when there were any festivals except kind of in that month. And Bede also uses the plural. So which one is Easter supposedly falling on? Why does Easter fall when it does? Well, that's got nothing to do with paganism. That's got everything to do with the fact that the Gospels say Jesus was crucified.
Which is why it's a movable holiday.
So, exactly. Now, the problem for the Christians was they liked celebrating Easter Sunday on a Sunday. And that's why one of the things the Council of Nicaea did discuss was, when do we celebrate Easter? Because some Christians were celebrating it in line with Passover, which meant Easter, the day in which they celebrated Jesus' resurrection, could fall on a Wednesday, a Thursday, a Friday, depending on the cycle of the moon. So what it was ruled was that it had to fall on a Sunday after the first full moon of the equinox. So that's why Easter falls when it does. That's got nothing to do with paganism. It's got everything to do with what the Gospels say about when Jesus died. And as you point out, in all the other languages of Europe, it's not called Easter. It's called something ultimately derived from the Hebrew word peat, which is Passover. So it's called Pascha or Pascal or something along those lines. So is there anything pagan about Easter? The word, kind of. That's it. So where do the eggs and the bunnies come from? Well, eggs were forbidden to people in Lent. So Lent being the 40 days leading up to Easter, you were meant to fast, which meant you couldn't use any foods that had animal products. Fish, for some reason, are exempt. So you can eat fish, but you couldn't eat meat, you couldn't eat eggs, you couldn't eat butter, and you couldn't eat any milk products.
Modern Catholic fasting is beak sauce.
People had all this. Oh, hopeless by comparison. So what happened was that people used up all that stuff at the beginning of Lent. So this is why on Shrove Tuesday, the Tuesday before Ash Wednesday, the beginning of Lent, people made pancakes because they used butter, eggs, and milk. So they were using up all this stuff that they had, but no one would tell the chickens.
Right, they kept laying.
Lent. They kept laying, right? So what that meant was, in the last weeks of Lent, you had all these eggs. And maybe even before that, you might have been sort of hard boiling them or pickling them to preserve them. So this is why eggs became associated with the end of Lent and became associated with Easter, because you finally got to eat something other than bloody fish. And by that stage, eggs would be looking pretty delicious. And then that's where the Easter eggs, decorating the eggs, came from, and so on. The bunnies is interesting. There are several animals who in Northern Europe were traditionally associated with Easter. There was the Easter fox, the Easter goose, and the Easter hare. And these are all animals that become much more active in early spring. Hares in particular are quite solitary and quite shy, but they coming towards Easter, that's their mating period, and that's where male hares come out into the field and start competing for mates. They start boxing. And so people used to see these animals, foxes starting to come out of hibernation geese coming back to northern Europe from the south, and hares out in the fields, and that was a sign that Easter was coming. That's how they associated with Easter. For some reason, everyone's forgotten about the Easter goose bringing eggs and the Easter fox bringing eggs, but the Easter hare got brought from northern Germany to the United States, became the Easter bunny, and then with the commercialization and the rise of chocolate eggs and so on, you got
So
chocolate
our
bunnies as well.
modern Easter bunnies and
Pagan?
eggs are sort of more of a capitalism thing than a pagan thing, because it's easy to market.
It's
Right.
like Halloween.
And hey, look, I like a good chocolate egg, so I'm not complaining here. You know.
Yeah. And look, the thing is, frankly, I don't care if something's got a pagan origin, but if people are claiming something's got a pagan origin that it doesn't, then
Right.
I care about history. I know it can come across as a bit of a spoil sport, but Halloween's another one. People say it was originally it was a pagan festival of Samhain. It was a festival of the dead, where the dead could come back. It was when druids would sacrifice people to the old gods, and so people would leave out jack-o'-lanterns as a substitute. And there's all this crap, absolute garbage. Yes, there was an ancient Celtic festival at that time that fell on that date, the evening before there was a celebration before that, and yes, it was called Samhain. But All Saints' Day, and Halloween is the eve of All Saints' Day, was established long before any kind of contact with Ireland or any of those Celtic areas, and it was established in Rome, and it then got imported to Ireland, and it just happened to coincidentally to fall on the same day as Samhain, and so its eve fell on the same day as the eve of Samhain. Now, were there carryovers of cult or folk traditions associated with Samhain into the Halloween traditions? Maybe, but the ones that seem most likely to have actually been pagan or pre-Christian traditions aren't the ones that have survived today. So the main one that does seem to have had some kind of pre-Christian origin is the practice of building a bonfire on Samhain Eve and watching it burn down. We don't know exactly what that was all about, but that was a practice in Ireland, Western Britain, Wales, Cornwall, well into the modern period. But the practices that we associate with Halloween, trick or treating, jack-o'-lanterns, and the whole concept of ghosts and the supernatural, the dead, they all seem to be Christian in origin. And I've got an article on this,
which again is
History
linked
for
in the
Atheists.
description. Everybody, go check it out.
Okay. So yeah, historyforatheists.com. So look, I'm a bit of a spoil sport when I sort of point out that this stuff isn't pagan. The idea that Christmas was originally Saturnalia and that the church hijacked this pagan festival of Saturnalia is wrong. Saturnalia was on December 17th and it finished December 23rd. So that doesn't account for December 25. The other one that you get is December 25th was the feast of Mithras. It was the feast of Mithras, the sun god. That's actually based on one reference in one calendar, and it doesn't actually mention Mithras at all. It just talks about the unconquered one, and we don't really know what it refers to. And there doesn't seem to, and there's no other evidence of any kind of pagan festival on December 25th. December 25th was traditionally regarded as the winter solstice, and that does seem to have been one of the reasons why, out of about 6 or 7 dates, that was the date that eventually became the one that was used to celebrate the birth of Jesus. But the other reason seems to be that there was a tradition that people died, the great prophets died, on the same day that they were conceived. So there's this idea that he was conceived, on March 25th. He died on March 25th, or what's 9 months after March 25th?
In fact,
December 25th. So that does seem to be a major reason why.
And March 25th, for those who are familiar with some of the more traditional churches, is the Feast of the Annunciation, which is God coming and telling Mary, hey, you're going to have Jesus.
That's where he was supposedly conceived. The idea that, well, okay, but a lot of the practices that we have at Christmas, like gift giving, decorating with boughs from fir trees and holly and ivy and so on, these are all pagan, and they were all done at Saturnalia. Again, no evidence. Gift giving was done at Saturnalia, but it died out, and our gift giving tradition associated with Christmas is actually, again, a Christian thing, which originally happened on the feast of St. Nicholas, which is December 6th, I think. And then very, very recently, that gift-giving tradition from the feast of St. Nicholas, Santa Claus, became associated with December 25th. And so the two things came together. So our gift-giving tradition has got nothing to do with the ancient Roman one. And the decorating with boughs and holly and ivy and all that stuff, one, there's no reference to that anywhere in any of the references to ancient Roman traditions around Saturnalia. And two, what else are you going to decorate your house with?
It's pretty much all evergreens. That's the only thing around.
It's exactly right. So to say that there's, and same with mistletoe, people say, oh, well, mistletoe, there's lots of pagan associations with mistletoe. Yeah, there are, but also it's an evergreen. So, of course.
Also, good luck finding something that doesn't have any pagan symbolism in an area that had a pagan religion for thousands of years. Exactly. Everything has some meaning. That is insufficient to connect this as like an actual causal relationship.
Yeah. And the other one is that Santa Claus is originally based on the Viking god Odin, and that Odin would fly through the sky and distribute presents and so on. And I always say, well, that's amazing. I've read pretty much everything that you can get your hands on regarding Viking mythology.
And it's nowhere in the
original Old Norse. Please show me where this is mentioned, and they never can.
It's in that third Edda. It's neither prose nor verse. It's the middle voice Edda. You don't hear about it much. All right. Well, I think we're gonna start wrapping things up here. So thank you very much. We've been going for just over 2 hours, which is, I mean, I don't always even get to 2 hours. So this has been a lot of fun. So everyone, please, Tim's blog, History for Atheists, there we go, is linked in the description. Please check it out. It has a lot of really good articles, and if you want to see Tim's whole breakdown of that Iron Rod debate that we mentioned, it's a doozy. It's pretty good in there. And like I said, that was the first thing I read of his. As far as this channel goes, let's see. I need to pull up a calendar so I don't get things wrong. Okay, so Tuesday should be a Jackson with Jackson. As you guys might know, our regularly scheduled episode of that, which was going to be on the 16th, ended up not happening because for some reason I couldn't upload to the YouTube ingest server. So we're going to be making that up on the 30th. On the 2nd, there's going to be the penultimate episode of Helping Cindy Lincoln. Then on the 4th, or maybe the 5th, we're going to be doing some kind of debate is currently the plan. A creationist who goes by Sunflower on the internet is going to be discussing viral evolution and irreducible complexity with Rutgers biology professor Dr. Dan Stern-Cardinal, who got his PhD was in viral evolution. So we have an actual expert on this specific topic who is coming in to talk about it with a young Earth creationist. So that'll be fun. Actually, he might be an old Earth creationist. I'm not sure. So, and Tim, do you have anything coming up that you want people to know about to stay on the lookout for?
Yeah, look, I've got if I can finish editing it today, I should be putting up my video on Constantine, his conversion and the Bible on my video channel. And towards the end of this month, I'm going to have the first annual Atheist Bad History Awards. So I'll be asking for nominations on my Twitter account.
I have a few ideas.
Feel free to. Yeah. Oh, there's some hot competition, but we'll see who wins. So that's coming up.
All right. The Venerable Beast says that he had a question. I'm sorry. We had a whole 2 hours. My one piece of advice is if you super chat a question, that's a guarantee that I'm going to read that question out. Otherwise, I have to go in the order that I take them, and like I said, we got to 2 hours. There's also a question as to whether or not Tuesday is Kent Hovind's next court date. I don't know. I have not been keeping track of the current Kent Hovind thing that closely. Although I have been talking to Cindy Lincoln, his ex. We just talked yesterday, I think. Yeah, it was last night. So I am keeping in touch with Cindy, making sure she's okay and whatnot. But I'm not following the legal side of that as closely as I could, and closely enough to know when the next court date is. Sorry. But I think that's going to be it after a little weird update on Kent Hovind, because he's a big topic of discussion around here. I don't know if you know, Tim.
Yeah. I'm aware of
I have a regular show in which I look at some of his older videos and we make a drinking game out of it, because it's not serious work, so it shouldn't be taken seriously. So we drink about it. All right, guys, thank you very much. I hope to see all of you on Tuesday. And also, please, like I said, do go check out Tim's blog. It's really great. And with that, we're out of here. I just want to take a moment to thank my channel members and my patrons on Patreon. They really help keep the lights on here. And I want to thank those pledging $20 or above, especially Bob Knob, Bent Hovind, Ian Chen, Chris Love, Sphincter of Doom, The Venerable Bede, Pat L. Dennis, and Res Instance. Without the support of those whose names you see on screen right now, the channel simply wouldn't exist as it does now, and I certainly wouldn't be able to do 2 to 3 videos a week for over a year and a half now. If you would like to help support and make it so that this channel is something that can keep going, there is a link to join below the video, as well as a link to the Patreon in the channel description. If pledging money isn't right for you, please just hit like on this video, subscribe to the channel, and share my videos. That really helps my channel grow.